Thank you, everyone, and I hope you had a really enjoyable coffee break, as well as processing everything we've heard about circularity and sustainability and the challenges and the opportunities that we see ahead. It's my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker of the day. This person has been, I think, really foundational also in my own journey of thinking about both research and industrialized construction. Professor Jennifer Whyte was a visiting scholar on sabbatical at CIFE in 2015, if I have it right. And that's when I first met her. And she has a long history of being involved with digitalization, with thinking about how that impacts and transforms the way that we deliver projects and infrastructure. So it was a great honor for me to take her class and to learn from her. And then she invited me, or I guess another way to say it is that I asked and forced my way to be able to come to Imperial College, where she was located at the time. And was a visiting researcher during my PhD, where I was also exposed to how the UK was thinking about industrialized construction, or as they call it, MMC, modern methods of construction. So now I feel like it's really a great honor that almost 10 years later to welcome her back as one of our keynote speakers, to give her perspective on and lessons about the IC approaches and ventures in a larger scale. So with that, please welcome Professor Jennifer Whyte from the University of Sydney.
Thank you, Daniel. And it's really a pleasure to be here and to be back in CIFE. And it's 9 years since I was a visiting professor here. Really a great honor to be back here. And thank you so much. Great to see some old friends and some new faces. And also great to be part of the Building Point 4.0 tour from Australia, and to be with some really great colleagues from Australia here. So I'm coming from the University of Sydney, where I'm director of the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership. And I just want to acknowledge that I spend most of my time on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation at the University of Sydney, where our campuses stand, and to pay my respects to those people. I want to just start a little bit with who I am and why I'm talking to you, and the kind of research that I do. But I'm really going to talk today about the UK transforming construction agenda. And that's because Daryl's talked to you before, and Duncan will talk to you about what's happening in Australia. And so I want to bring the perspective that I've gained from being part of the UK Transforming Construction Agenda, where I've had the most close relationship with policy making and how we do this at a systems level. And we were talking earlier about how this is a systems change that's needed in construction, and really the effort that the UK made to try and transform that system and to make that systems change. And out of that, what we learned about business models for DFMA and platform strategies. So this is the day job. So at the moment, I'm director of the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership at the University of Sydney. Mission to improve project leadership in Australia and internationally. And we're thinking about project leadership in terms of changing technologies. I tend to think about digital technologies, but we could think about industrialized construction as another area in which it's changing our project models, the changing organizational dynamics of projects, the need for projects for sustainable, resilient, and just futures. And for us, a lot of work goes across those themes, but those are the themes that we've kind of laid out. As this forum, we're 10 years old, so the John Grill Institute was celebrating its 10-year anniversary, and we're really interested in that flywheel of research-informed education and practice-informed research, and how we work between academia and other parts of the sector, so industry and government. But what I'm really going to focus on today is the sort of journey that I took to get to that role. And really, I wanted to flag that my interests have been in three main areas. So we've done a lot of research, and I'm going to cherry pick things because I've been working in research and building teams to do research for 25 years. And so I can't tell you all of that in a short presentation, but I wanted to give you a flavor for the kinds of topics that we've engaged in and to cherry pick a few examples. And so the area that I'm most interested in at the moment is really around these sort of broad questions about project leadership. How do we set up the ecologies of projects that enable us to do more innovative, more useful things to make desirable futures? How do we think about future making in this world where we have really big challenges, both of climate change but also of social equity? And how do we think about systems approaches to projects and to see them as interventions into wider systems? So that's the area that's really of interest to me in some of my current research. And that's come out of looking at some of the major projects in the London mega project ecology, and now looking at some of the major projects and their interconnections in Sydney and also around the eastern seaboard of Australia. But really a basis for some of that thinking has been working on production systems and on systems integration. So I had the Laing O'Rourke Royal Academy of Engineering chair in systems integration at Imperial College London from 2015 to 2021. And actually, I applied for it while I was over in Stanford on my visiting professorship. So it was a turning point for my career working with Laing O'Rourke and really understanding their approaches to design for manufacture and assembly and managing change, thinking about managing change and handover of major projects. And we did a lot of executive education for the Building Construction Authority in Singapore on DFMA and integrated digital delivery. So we were written into, my team was written into their integrated digital delivery strategy. And thinking about manufacturing and the kind of work that goes on in a factory, but also then assembly on site and the kinds of improvements that you can make in assembly on site. And I'll come back to both of these examples that are on the picture. And the third area, so a little bit more on this production systems integration, DFMA, managing change, handover piece. So, I mean, we were thinking quite hard about systems integration and how we might reframe systems integration and think about it from a process perspective on projects. And, you know, I found this sort of V diagram very helpful, actually, that comes out of systems integration for helping people not see projects as being linear, but letting them see the kinds of testing, the verification and validation that needs to be done at different levels in a system, from the parts to the components to assembly, subsystems and systems. And I know Calvin's also been thinking very hard about parts and how we put parts together in these kinds of production systems that we work in. Thinking about how we manage digital information and the kind of configuration management challenges that we have. And I know that term's not always very well known in this industry, but this idea of how you keep your digital information and your physical assets and your requirements in sync with each other. And we did some thinking about that, working with one of the major projects in London, Crossrail. And then we got a small bit of funding to do some work with Airbus and CERN and Crossrail, looking at how they managed change in large projects. And, you know, a lot of my work, although I did my PhD on housing, a lot of my work has been on big infrastructure projects, or where buildings meet infrastructure, so stations, airports, big scale projects, where actually there's a lot of opportunity for standardization that is sometimes not taken. Yeah. And it was really interesting bringing Airbus and CERN and Crossrail together because, we went round and interviewed them individually. We flew around Europe, we went and saw them and kind of talked to them. And they were desperately interested in being in the same room together and having a conversation. And so, they flew themselves over to London and we sat in some of the offices in Crossrail. And it was really interesting because they told each other far more than they told us as researchers when we'd gone and interviewed them separately. But also, they had shared problems of how do you manage these big projects that have masses of data, but it becomes almost unmanageable, and how do we as humans sort of cope with understanding the kind of systems changes, making these projects tractable. And so that was the challenge of the explosion of information that we have around projects and using it in intelligent ways rather than drowning in sort of information overload, which even on relatively small projects can become an issue. And so this is the sort of work that I've been doing around production systems. I also did quite a lot of work on how digital information is transforming the delivery of major projects. And I think one of the presentations earlier really underlined for me this point around the growing integration that digital technologies brings, bringing together project deliverables, supply-based interactions, and also your relationship with your end users. Suddenly your end users can be in the same sort of world as your supply chain digitally. And so we did some work on the kind of project models, if you like, that enable that handover of data across organizational boundaries on the larger projects as you're trying to hand things into operations and maintenance and use. And, that becomes really important when you're thinking about design for disassembly. That information really needs to flow with the physical components. And we need to start to think that we're not in an industry that builds physical things. We're an industry that builds physical things and digital things, and that they go together and that they travel together through the life cycle. And, finding the organizational structures that allow us to do that in inter-organizational projects, I think, is still a challenge for us. So I want to spend most of the rest of the talk talking about the work that I did on involved in the transforming construction agenda in the UK. I ended up on the main board of Construction Leadership Council, which is the organisation through which the construction sector talks to government in the UK. And I ended up there because I was on the Transforming Construction Advisory Group, which was looking after the 170 million investment as part of the construction sector deal to improve construction. And I was also on a steering board that got put together post-Grenfell to hold the industry to account, given the disaster that had happened. So a high-rise block of flats had gone up in flames during a retrofit project, and it was really a wake-up call for the industry. I wasn't on the inquiry around the project itself, but I was on the committee that got put together to look at the sector to say, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? And frankly, sitting on that board, the sector did not look good. Yeah, you're sitting next to people from the Airports Authority, from chemical engineering, from other safety-critical industries, saying, if you're building buildings that are more than 6 stories that people sleep in, you're in a safety-critical industry, yeah, and you need to understand what that means, yeah. And Judith Hackett, who ran that, was a chemical engineer, so she was sort of process mapping, the ways that buildings get put together. And just identifying the gaps, right? And being really, really fed up that people going around the industry, people said, oh, I knew that would happen. not good enough, right? You're in a safety critical industry. And so I learned a lot through being on those two essentially parallel bits of policy making in the UK, and then also how they tried to stitch those together. And really making this argument that if you want to transform a low-cost, low-technology, conflictual industry into a high-value, high-tech, collaborative industry, then you need a different relationship with the research base. And how we think about that relationship between universities, the industry, and government, is really important in terms of making the kind of the right connections to have a high-tech construction sector. And so the transforming construction agenda in general, and the Network Plus that got put in place to work with the academic community, was really focused around these 4 areas, around construction, manufacturing, energy, and digital, and how they interrelate. The Network Plus, I have to say, was a relatively small amount of the funding, but I think was really significant in connecting with and also transforming the research base. So bringing academics who were used to looking in traditional ways within these 4 areas and getting them to look at how they interacted with each other, but also how they thought about supporting industrial construction and a new kind of industry. So we would talk about modern methods of construction, but we can talk about industrial construction. A relatively short program. I think a long-term program is perhaps more effective, but a 2-year program, we had small calls, we had engagement events, we had a program of research, and it linked to the larger Transforming Construction Challenge. So really important to create the connections between leading industry and the research base. There's this sort of wider context for that we were very connected into. So I gave oral evidence at the House of Lords Select Committee on Off-Site Manufacturing for Construction, Building for Change. We were heavily involved in engaging with the different parts of this program and sitting on the advisory board for the investment in the Core Innovation Hub and the Active Buildings Centre, and then this research program that went with it. And so we might talk a bit about what the different models are for how we make the systems change in our sectors. This investment has finished, and so there's a publication of the kind of processes and achievements, and a sort of list of the outputs that came out of the Transforming Construction Challenge. I wanted to quickly highlight a few things because I want to leave some time for questions. So I wanted to highlight three examples from the UK that I think are really, for me, they were particularly striking, and I know there are people in the room who've travelled and seen things in the UK, and you may have other examples, and I would be interested to hear them. But HTA architects and their volumetric supplier, and I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the volumetric supplier, but they worked very closely together. And in fact, the volumetric supplier did all of the construction work on site because they were highly finished volumes, and they wanted to make sure that their people installed them. And they built the highest volumetric steel-framed building in the UK. It was actually higher than they had in Singapore at the time when we built it. And there was a little bit of kind of rivalry, competition when we had some of the colleagues over from Singapore visiting the site. Lang O'Rourke, one of the early movers in this space, had really been tweaking and optimizing things in its factory for many years now. Has a very strong manufacturing capability, and I think partly coming out of being a concrete subcontractor, has that close relationship with the materials and has really been able to leverage that. And Brighton Wood would be the third example that I would highlight. So they've done a lot of work on, they're an architects by background, but they've done a lot of work on these kind of digital platforms and some very interesting ideas that they've published, and they publish their software open source, and they get their advantage, if you like, through the consulting and the work that they do alongside their software, but they publish it to the community to use. I was involved in some of the work on business models with Jirka and Daniel, and really interesting work on that. I wanted to just flag that, you know, that need to sort of break the mirror, you know, and deal with the way that, you know, mature industries tend to have organizational structures that mirror their product structures. You know, it's certainly in these large projects, you need a sort of modular product structure, but a kind of integral organization. So these collaborative project models, these IPD models, to bring that together, those modular components together, was something that we found even when we were studying Heathrow Terminal 5 some time ago now. The investment in the UK looked quite hard at product platforms and was really trying to do what Daryl was talking about around the kind of interfaces, the USB interfaces. So trying to think about how you would put that kit of parts together and make it interoperable. I'm not sure they came up with the next USB solution, but that was their kind of ambition, was to bring major parties together to look at that. I was very struck by, so I'd been doing this work on the big projects looking at digital transformation. I was very struck by this piece that Brighton Wood were doing. So this is the modularity and platform strategies, because it really does take us, and we've heard this from a number of speakers, from looking at project by project, looking at platform-based strategies where you're looking across projects, and the innovation is not happening on a project level, but across a range of projects. And I had a doctoral student, Alexander Joe, that did a little bit of work on platform-based strategies, also visited Daniel in TU Delft. In ETH Zurich, actually, yeah, in Zurich. And he was looking at companies in China, in Hong Kong, and in Singapore, and the way that their modularization strategies were really affected by the capabilities in the environment. And it's partly what's sort of pushed me to look at the kind of project ecologies. Because, you know, one challenge you have is, are there available competencies? Yeah. But the other challenge you have is, are those capabilities reliable? And so what we were seeing was that firms that took an approach to modularize through platform strategies, through this kind of capital light approach, really put a lot of effort into the reliability of the competencies and how they would achieve those through standards, monitoring, product control. And indeed, two of the three firms that we looked at brought competencies in-house because they couldn't achieve the reliability externally. I'm going to, I've covered all the things that I want to cover. I just want to finish on some really old building. So 50 years, we're celebrating 50 years of the Sydney Opera House in Sydney at the moment. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Paolo Stracchi, has spent a lot of time in the last few years going through the construction archives of the Sydney Opera House. And he is telling the Australian story of the Sydney Opera House. So I think we know that it was delivered by a Danish architect, and actually two Danish engineering firms that came to Sydney for the Opera House are still there. Arup and the mechanical and electrical engineers are still there. But the contractor was an Australian company. And it was building pedestrian bridges. There's a not very promising-looking pedestrian bridge that goes to the University of Sydney. That was actually, in some senses, prototype for the kind of ribs that were built here. So they turned the engineering and the design work into a buildable building through a fabrication strategy. So they fabricated the stuff in the yard near the construction site. I think there are plenty of things that we've actually improved in the 50 years. Yeah, you can see a lot of people working at height. You can see a lot of construction challenges. But I think it's interesting to remember that prefabrication has a long history in Australia. So it's not that we can't do it. Yeah, that we can do it. And in fact, we can do it better than we could do it 50 years ago. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for a very interesting tour through several years of trying to get this industry to have a better ecosystem. My thinking about the industry is that it is structured the way it is with multiple trade subcontractors for one primary reason that some of the capital-heavy prefabricators never really understood. And that is that unlike semiconductors, unlike automobiles, unlike other products, the demand for products in this industry is large, lumpy, and unpredictable. And so it's really difficult to keep an integrated value chain working at capacity at every stage. And so you really have to have each stage of the value chain working with multiple projects and multiple others in the value chain. And it's very hard to break that. And so when we think about reorganizing the industry, you don't see very many contractors anywhere in the world that bring all the trades under one roof. The closest could be in Japan, where you have subcontractors that do a lot of their work, in some cases 90% for one general contractor, but even they do work outside. And so in countries where there's a long-term steady supply of social housing, like in Norway and in the UK and others, you can do capital, in Sweden, you can do capital-intensive manufacturing, and there's a steady supply of work to do that. But it's very difficult in other stages. So finding a way to get this ecosystem to work together, it obviously doesn't work together well with fixed price lump sum contracts all around, where everybody is fighting everybody else for a piece of the pie. Integrated project delivery is one approach, and possibly bringing the designers under the roof of the contractors in the way that some of the speakers this morning suggested, using digital technologies so that you don't need a whole design firm, you need one or two designers with very clever parametric and other software tools. Might be one way to go. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, one thing that's interesting on very big projects is you've often got very repeatable components, and we don't always see them as repeatable, and so they end up being designed as bespoke. Yeah, and I think Laing O'Rourke built one of the Crossrail stations. They built Custom House. They actually got a reference design that was an in-situ design. And they went back to the client and said, we can build this faster using an off-site manufacturing approach. Now, Laing O'Rourke is a private company. It directly employs labour, and that's quite different from a lot of other companies in the UK. And I think being private allows you to take a longer-term view. You're not reliant on shareholders and their requirements. Directly employing labour also allows you to invest in labour. Yeah, and I think it's much harder when the labour is very fragmented. Yeah, and you're not getting that. Yeah, I think there's real ethical reasons to take as much labour as we can off construction sites to do with the mental health of the employees in our industry, right? Because not just about health, but also not just about safety, but also about mental health. That people can have stable employment, they can go to work, and they can come back again. And I think so I think that the bits of the industry where we see innovation, there are often some factors that are different from the general industry. Yeah, and the challenge is, how do we change the whole industry, right?
Next question here. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for a wonderful presentation. My name is Ivanka from ETS Montreal. I would have many questions, and I love the Sydney Opera House as a wonderful example of prefabrication. I would ask about the role of the owners and maybe mainly of public owners in this process. How do you see their role? Do you think they can be really a very important part of this transformation that we are trying to incur?
I mean, that is the UK strategy, right? So the UK strategy is a government owner-driven strategy. So really very explicitly, not the government as a regulator, but the government as an owner of and client for construction is what's driving that strategy. And so there was a lot of work on putting together a construction playbook, because what they realized was that, you know, some senior civil servants understood this, but there were lots of people who were, you know, commissioning buildings through different departments who, you know, or local authorities who didn't get it. And so the construction playbook is in, what's the term they use? Basically, you have to explain why you're not using an industrialized construction strategy. So the presumption in favor of industrialized construction. And that was a journey to get to it. Sitting in Construction Leadership Council, I was involved in some of that work on the construction playbook. And the reason it was a journey was that we didn't write it, government wrote it. You know, and they had to write it because they had to own it, yeah. And so there was a little bit of trying to influence the process, but not take ownership of the approach.
We have one last question, and Matthew, I know you had your hand, but Renata was first, so I want to give it to her. So unless
it was a follow-up.
Okay,
That's
then
okay.
it's a follow-up. Then we have a
Yeah, no, it was just a follow-up. Obviously, the UK, a lot of us.
and who are you?
Oh, sorry. My name is Matthew Aitchison. I'm also from Building 4.0 CRC, one of the very many Australians here today. As an Australian with the particular relationship we have with the UK, we're aware of the leading policy work that you've obviously been involved in and that comes out of the UK. I wonder, do you have any data or insights, Jennifer, into the uptake of that policy?
I wish I had more insights, and it's certainly a question that I'm going to ask when I'm back in the UK in the Australian winter. You know, and I think there have been some successes and failures, as there have been in the Bay Area, in terms of some of the startups around this space. I think the conversation has changed, and the government presumption in favour of offsite has changed. And so, you know, but what's the percentage? I don't know. So I'd have to come back to you. Yeah.
And we have time for a short question and a short answer from Renata.
Jennifer, awesome to have you
and
back.
who are you?
Question, again, hi, Renata Fruchter with Stanford CIFE and Project-Based Learning Lab in Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. And the short question is, what are your insights through your journey, how to balance between policy and leadership now that you are the director of the leadership?
Well, I mean, I think, one of the things that was interesting sitting on Construction Leadership Council was I was sitting next to the leaders of some of the major projects in London. You know, and I think I was really struck by the work that Andy Mitchell was doing on Tideway, because what he was doing was at quite a high level changing the way that people thought about a project. So I think as you know, a lot of us in the room may come from construction and civil engineering. We're often very interested in our piece of that, yeah. And you know, I think in the UK, Crossrail got into trouble because it thought of itself as a construction civil engineering project, and it didn't understand the integration that's needed across a whole range of components to make something work. And he really changed the conversation around. He was building a big sewer, but he stopped saying, "I'm building a tunnel," and he started saying, "This is about the river. Call it Tideway. This is about how." You know, people are going to have a more pleasant environment to work in, to walk in, you know, they're not going to have sewage in their river. And so, you know, I think, you know, both in government and in the top level of projects, that messaging about what it is that we're doing. You know, I think you know, there's a really interesting dynamic conversation about what that messaging is. And in Construction Leadership Council, there's a lot of conversation about what that messaging is. You know, and in the UK, they decided to call net zero construction. Yeah, a very provocative title for the industry, zero construction. But, you know, to really get people to think about what we're doing as custodians of the built environment in a different way. And so I think the two things, I don't think they're in conflict. I think that shaping where we're going as a sector is something that government has to do and that the industry has to do as well. And that dialogue between them is really important.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you.